Hey everyone, this is the Marketing Share Podcast. We're glad to be back with you. I'm Alec Chung, your host, and with me as always is my co-host Barb. Barb, today's topic, we're going to talk about something that is, I think, really important for marketing leaders, but it's not the typical thing that we cover, which is about, like a certain discipline within marketing. Today, it's really more about one of the more intangible things about leadership, and that's executive presence, right? We always hear that term, right? But what is executive presence?
If you think about it, right, when you are the leader of the marketing organization and you're in this seat for the first time, or maybe you're multiple times in, but you are in this seat, your job is to have influence over your team and your projects, right? So executive presence is kind of really an unsung hero, right? And you know it when you see it, but you're not really sure how to obtain it sometimes, I think. So this is such an important topic, and I love it because so many marketers are working so hard, but executive presence is a different skill set, isn't it?
Yeah, it totally is. And as much as we talk about wanting to teach leaders what they need to know in order to run marketing, right? And usually that's about a marketing thing, but this is just as important. So we are super excited to have our guest on today, Drew Saur. Introducing Drew here. Hey, Drew, thanks for joining us. And I'm going to let Drew talk about his background, but Drew is an executive career coach. And I was on a workshop where he talked about executive presence, and I realized that, hey, executive presence is like, it's an intangible thing and you don't really know what it is, but Drew has done the work of actually helping to define, what exactly is executive presence. So we're excited to talk about him. Drew, tell us a little bit about, what you've done before, how you became a career coach now, which is your kind of currently what you do, and why you decided to develop this material around executive presence.
Yeah, sure. Thank Alec and Barb, both of you. Pleasure to be here today. And, my story, I spent most of my career in industry. I'm a little more on the technology side, but I was in financial services in New York for 25 years. I had a great career. I was a chief operating officer sort of at the end of that period. And my boss at the time retired. And I had to decide what I wanted to do next. And I was lucky enough in that I had sort of done what I wanted to do in the corporate world and realized that one of my favorite parts of the job was like leadership development, right? And I think back to my early career when I was trying to become an executive for the first time. And, I got a lot of great mentorship. I got a lot of great support, but it still took a while. And kind of, Barb, it's what you said earlier, it's this thing called executive presence that I needed to develop. And the best advice I got at the time was, well, just keep going, just keep work harder, learn it, you'll get it eventually. And when I got to the other side of the table, I started thinking about, this is an area that people need help with. And when I started to become kind of this executive coach, I really honed in on this kind of transition to the executive levels and tried to put together some practical tips around, okay, what is this executive presence and how do you develop? And I've been doing this for a little over 3 years now, but it's a very needed skill. And I'm happy to be here and share with you today.
I totally know colleagues and friends of mine who had that same coaching experience, right? You need to develop more executive presence, right? Sometimes we all get that and it's like, thanks, what's that, right? So how do you define executive presence?
Yeah, sure. So executive presence is one of those terms. It is actually very hard to define. And as most people say, I know it when I see it, but I don't know what it is. So what I try to do is put together a structure that at least gives a framework for how to think about whether or not you have it. And there's really the three components, right? So the first is literally what you talk about and the subjects you choose is a good indicator. The second is how you talk about it. And this is literally the mechanics of what you say, how concise you are, things like that. And then the third piece is who you are talking with. So between those three, you can get a good sense of whether or not you have this sort of ephemeral thing called executive presence.
I think when I heard you talking about that, Drew, that was what immediately kind of pulled me in a little bit because it's relatively straightforward once you think about it. It's just that most people don't take the time to kind of just break it down to something so logical. So I really like how it's also that the power of three thing. So it's that's catchy too. But let's dig into that, right? Let's talk about that first one, right? So exactly what is it that we need to be talking about so that we can create better executive presence?
Yeah, and the first thing that I usually suggest with people is this concept of thinking like an owner. And what I mean by that is most of us go through our careers focused on our function, right? We have a job, we do that job, we do it well. But from an executive perspective, you're really responsible for the whole enterprise. And so a good way to do that is to just pretend you own the whole thing, right? Act as if. And so if you owned it, what other questions would you ask? Who else would you talk to? And just by doing that first reframe, you start to ask different questions, which immediately lets people know that you're thinking about the business differently and more like an executive. So that's a great place to start.
The other thing is
also, I think I remember when you think that way too, it also gives you, I think it feels like it gives you the permission to like go ask more questions, because sometimes you might feel like, well, that's not my area, right? So I'm just going to kind of keep to my area. But when you were thinking like an owner, it gives you that permission to feel like, well, I do want to ask a little bit more. I want to dig in a little bit more and kind of understand that better, right?
Exactly, because as an executive, you are part of the team. You are part of the team that's running the whole show, not an individual doing an individual contribution. And you need to know what everybody else is doing. And by thinking like an owner, a lot of times it does give you that little extra boost to say, hey, I don't really understand what they're doing over there. Maybe I should give them a call. Maybe I should ask and find out. So yeah, it's a great way to start to build some of those relationships.
I also think it's about connecting the dots sometimes on what your contribution is and what it means to the business. Isn't that part of how you kind of refer to this as well in executive presence?
Yeah, because ultimately you need to know how you connect to the big picture, right? And again, this idea of stepping out of your comfort zone, getting a broader sense of what your purpose is. That purpose is to help grow the business in some way. And so how do you connect with, and you can kind of almost go through all the different departments, right? So let's say you're in marketing. Okay, it might be obvious how you connect to sales, maybe engineering, but what about legal? What about HR? Like every piece of the company has a connection to what you do. And so by understanding that impact, it is a great place to sort of start thinking differently about this subject.
I always coach my people that curiosity is one of the strongest kind of character traits that I think you need to have as a marketer. So I think that lends itself really well here, because like in order to expand your knowledge about the business, you have to be curious enough to ask more questions, right? So it's not enough anymore to just focus on only what marketing does. You really do have to be curious enough to know, like, hey, wait, I do want to understand, like, how do we actually make these widgets or whatever it is, right? And you might not think that as a marketer you need to know that, but if you're going to have more influence and have that type of presence, I think you do need to be curious enough, right? I don't know. What do you tell your, to tell the folks that you coach?
Yeah, and the idea here is that you are now the most senior individual in your discipline, right? So again, if you're the head of marketing, you are theoretically the most senior person, which by definition means all of your peers probably know nothing about marketing. And so when you flip to the other side, if you were in that one of those peers, they don't understand what you do. They don't understand why it's important. And so you need to start to build these bridges between the different functions. And a lot of this idea of executive presence is who's building the bridge? Are you waiting for them to come to you? Or are you the person starting to build a bridge to the other organizations? And by building it, that's a great indicator that you are starting to practice this, vague thing called executive presence.
I think that's brilliant, because you're really kind of looking at it from a different perspective, right? It also kind of feeds into this notion of, let me tell you what I do. Let me tell you what I'm responsible or for what my team has done and some of the impact. How do you kind of tell people to shift gears on those perspectives?
And again, it's really just kind of moving it up is the simplest way to think about it. And one of the other areas is like just, again, growing your general business knowledge, right? Because this idea of, okay, how do I impact these other groups? And again, it's not about the marketing, right? For all of the people listening here, that is your job, that is your function. But ultimately, the marketing has a purpose. The purpose is to launch a new product, enter a new market, build a business. And that's really where you have to show other people how you connect. Because, again, the head of engineering is trying to figure out how to engineer this stuff. They're not thinking about marketing or sales or anything else. So part of your role is to help them understand not only what you do, but why would they actually care about what you do? Because you're trying to contribute to building the business just like them.
Yeah, it's almost like you can't just talk about what you do as a marketer anymore. You have to talk about what you do as a marketer in the context of the business, so that it makes sense to everyone else. I think that's what you're saying.
Right, exactly. Because it starts with this idea that nobody else really understands what you do, right? And this is for any senior executive, right? You are the most senior person. Your staff kind of all gets it, but people outside, they know vaguely what you do, right? But they don't really know how to attach it. And they're so busy trying to do what they're trying to do that they're not going to take the time to figure out why your stuff is important. So that's why it's up to you to be the advocate for your function. And the best way to do that is to show how your function contributes to everybody else, right? Connect it to their story is ultimately what you're trying to do.
Yeah. I remember when I came into a business group, right? And we had multiple channels of business that we were working on. And the marketing person was so eager to tell me all the activities that they were doing, right? That's a telltale sign. And then I said, wow, that's really interesting. How big is the business? And this person was like sort of stumped. They didn't even, they were so busy on their activities that they didn't even know the size and scope of their own business unit, which I thought was sort of interesting, right? It's a little bit of, sometimes we get so in the weeds of activities that we're forgetting, executive presence, and all of it is kind of how you are and how you come together in context of the whole, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the ways that we do this is how we think about the way we talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. In the way we maybe communicate differently. That's a nugget on how we can start to think executive presence, right? Tell us a little bit about how we talk about it.
Yeah, and so it's just to kind of connect to this. So we just talked about like, okay, what are you actually talking about? And we want the business outcome. And now we talk about how. And so again, a couple concepts here, but one to start out with this is the difference between sort of responsible and accountable, right? And those are terms that people may have heard before, but the short answer is this: the responsible is the task execution. And that's, Barb, what you just talked about, which is if you're worried about the task execution, yes, that's important. You can't forget about that stuff. But you are judged based on the overall impact of your function and how it sort of interacts with everybody else. And that's this kind of idea of accountable. You're not supposed to be executing anymore, right? You're the executive now. You're the head of the marketing department. You may still have to be in the weeds, but that's not the main purpose of your role. The main purpose of your role is to ensure to be accountable for marketing, making, and contribution, right? And so that's one way to think about it, is to, again, try to move away from the weeds, at least the way you talk about it, right? You may still have to execute that stuff, but the way you talk about it with other executives, it's about being accountable for the function, not the day-to-day stuff.
Mm-hmm. And you've actually shown that, I know through some of your presentation material, that is a big shift from, before, when you're really more in a functional role, and now you're taking over leadership, right? Explain that a little bit. I know you don't have your slides, but just kind of help them understand how that shift occurs.
Well, in the simple way to think about it is, even if you have a small function, right? Your job is, again, used to be to work in the function. So you take marketing, you used to work in marketing. Now you work on marketing. And the difference is you're looking at the function as a whole, taking yourself outside of it, right? So you have to sort of pretend, again, you are the head of the function, you are outside of it. And now you want to look at how well is it operating in the context of the overall business, right? And that's, again, it's just a new skill for a lot of people who are new to the executive role, is how do you take yourself out of your function and look at it in this broader perspective? But that's really critical for understanding, how it pieces together with a lot of the other things. And that's the ingredient. When I talk about being accountable, it's being able to look at your function as a slightly different perspective and assess it through a different lens than the doer lens that probably a lot of us were used to in the previous roles.
Hey, Barb, you know what? The part that's going to be hard for some of our listeners, though, is, and you and I are sometimes in the same boat, is when you're the one marketer. So you may be in charge of marketing, but marketing may be a department of one. So in that case, then you have to have both hats on, right? You have to be the doer, but then you also have to remember to that when you're talking with your CEO or the owner or the founder or whatever, you have to switch from the doer role and you have to switch more towards, okay, now I got to talk like a department head. So that can be an added.
So true. So true. Like, sometimes I think about it, I get in this one too, right? Where we have to tell people how to think about things that we're doing sometimes. So I always try to give that, let me tell you how I think about this. And that is a way to step back, even if you're, the party of one. It kind of makes you removed for a minute on the perspective side. And I think that's a helpful little trick that I've learned. Let me tell you how to think about this. Here's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and I was just to add into there, it is this sort of bifurcation of being able to do both those roles at the same time is actually a really important skill, because even if you do have a decent sized department, you still need to have the doer hat when you're talking to your own team, right? Because they still need to work with you, whether it's the campaigns, whether it's whatever you're working on, you still need to have that doer mentality. So it's never like you give it up. What you're doing is you're adding a second one, right? You're adding that executive persona, which is where this executive presence concept comes out. So it's really like adding to the toolkit of what you need to do.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, it applies even if you do have a sizable team. So that's fair. Yeah. Okay, you have more to say on this topic though of the how. So keep going a little bit. Share a little bit more.
Sure. So the next is again what I call them the 3 C's, right? And so this is literally when you are speaking, what are the 3 things to keep in mind, right? And so the first is concise. And that's just the rule at the executive levels, because again, you're the only person who's focused on marketing. Everybody else has a big day job. So you get a small slice of their time, right? So you don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of details. So you have to kind of practice this very short, concise way of speaking. And we can dive more into this, but one simple example is the, what, so what, now what as a model. Like you only get 3 things to say. What's going on? So what? Why is it important? Now what? Okay, now what do we do? And that's a great immediate frame to say, okay, keep it concise. So that's one. The second one is just the confidence. And this is a lot of, we can dive into kind of imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff, but you do have to kind of fake it till you make it a little bit and sort of, okay, you are the head now. So they put you in this role. Somebody believes you are capable. So you have to sort of pretend, at least for a while, until you really build that confidence. And the third one is composed. So concise, confident, and composed. And composed is really what happens when something goes wrong. Because again, this is a great test for executive presence because, and again, in my career and in my business, I've seen where people are asked uncomfortable questions, not because the person wants to know the answer, but because they want to see how they handle it, right? And so this idea of just being able to take a difficult question, a difficult scenario, not panic, think it through, answer professionally, get the information later, whatever you need to do, but that composure under pressure is another key indicator from the executive presence perspective. So those are 3 good ones.
Boy, if you do that well, you will definitely flex your muscle on this. I mean, that's artfully doing that is really the critical key to this. I've seen so many colleagues who are not too concise sometimes when they're speaking. You know how that is, and the executive will just like literally interrupt them and say, "Okay, and the point."
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's really important. The how is just as important as the what, because earlier when you were telling us about, hey, it's our job now as department leaders, right, to help explain and help others understand what we're doing. But that doesn't mean it's just now all of a sudden, just like spilling out everything, right? You got to do it, though, in this way, which you said, which is like concise. You have to have confidence when you do it. And I really love the point that you made, which was, sometimes you do get asked a question just to see whether you can handle a tough question, right? So part of that presence is being able to handle the tough question, but doing it in a nice way, or in an elegant way. So I really like that advice for sure.
Drew, tell us the difference between the we and the they, because this is kind of a rookie mistake I've seen being made sometimes, right? When you first get in that spot.
Yeah, and there's a couple of tells, right? So again, it's one of those things. Once you're in the role for a while, once you get comfortable with it, you can oftentimes easily detect kind of early executives and things like this just based on the words they use. And one of my favorite ways to do that is this, again, concept of we versus they. And the question is, when you said we did this, simple question is, who do you mean when you say we? And most of the time when people are coming up, when they say we, they mean me and my team, right? We did this campaign, we did this exercise, we did this project. As an executive, we changes, right? As a member of the executive team, we is you and your peers, right? So when we made a decision, I'm talking about me, if I'm the head of marketing, who partnered with the head of product and the sales, we together talked about this and we decided to go on this direction. And so if you say, well, we did this and you're only talking about your function, that immediately tells me that you see you see that word as a much narrower version than sort of more seasoned executive would. So it's a great little test to ask yourself, what do you mean when you use those words?
But I don't think your point is to say that when you're talking about marketing, then it's just, I did this. You can still talk about what your department did, right? But you have to distinguish between then also speaking at that as a member of the leadership team too, right? I think that's what you're
exactly.
getting at?
Just to be clear, like, especially the executive, you almost never say, I did this.
Yeah.
But that's almost never said.
Right.
So my team did this.
Yep.
And again, this goes back to that accountable part, that ability to kind of separate you. And rather than say, oh, we did this amazing thing, right? You say, no, my team, they're so awesome. They did this amazing, again, project, campaign, advertise, whatever it was. You step out and you can actually use the word they for your team, again, usually in a positive way, right? Where you're trying to, you never want to throw anybody in their bus. So it can be, if the only time actually, the one time you use I is when something goes wrong. Right?
Okay.
So just from an executive perspective, just to clarify, to put them all out there, the one time you use I is if something goes wrong. Yep, that's on me. I did not clarify with my team what we were supposed to do. I did not ask enough questions. That's, again, a very sort of executive presence thing, is to say, when things go wrong, back to the confidence and the composure, yep, I could have done a better job. I did not clarify the priority of this, so the team worked on other things. Yep, that's on me. Right. So the I is usually, again, for me because I missed something. They is for your team when they did that amazing stuff, that you are now the advertiser for your own team. And then we would be me and my fellow executives.
I actually used that the they and the we issue when I was coaching a team member, right? Because sometimes your teams will divert decision to someone else in some cases. Like, they told us we had to do that, right? Or and I said, wait, we're the leader of this function in this group. We are the they in this case, right? Don't be afraid to step into your leadership, right? That's sometimes, a coaching thing that we have to tell our own teams, because they'll be like, they made us do that, or that was them up there somewhere. No. We are the they. You have a voice in your decision. You are a leader.
Absolutely. And that's a good one in terms of your own team, right? And again, just a behavior you can check for yourself is, are you, quote unquote, blaming senior executives? Like, if an unpopular decision happened, okay, we had to do this, or we had to do a reduction, or we had to cut budgets. Did they do that? Or did we do that? And that's a real test, right? Because when it's something that's negative, it's easy when we're winning, right? If we're winning, then of course I want to be on that team. But if we had to do something difficult, are you confident enough in your position? Are you confident that you're a member of the senior executives that, yes, it was hard. No, we didn't want to do it, but we felt this was in the best interest of the business. And, while I wish there could be another way, I was part of that decision and I can take responsibility for it. That's another great kind of internal test is, okay, are you owning the big decisions that were made that may or may not be as popular as others?
Okay, so let's now get to the last part, which is whom, right? And whom you talk to. So we've covered the what you talk about, how you talk about it. So now talk to us a little bit about now, share your perspective on why is the whom part so important as well.
Yeah, and where I start with this one is this idea that in any career, in any field, there are really two things that determine your success, right? There's the results, the actual output that you're putting together, and there's the relationships. And this shifts over time. So when all of us started in the career, we were sort of a doer. We had a project. We're supposed to get stuff done. If you did a bang up job, you're going to get rewarded. You're going to get promoted. Hey, your results were amazing. We're going to keep going. And you had to have relationships with your boss, with your team members, but it was much less important. As you move up in your career, that shifts, right? And kind of middle management, it's like 50-50. And by the time you get to the senior executive role, the individual contribution that you're making is actually much smaller because you have other team members, you have other things going on. The relationships drive your success. And so when we talk about whom, the question is, which relationships are important for your success, your function's success, and the business's success? And those people, once again, are no longer in your function, right? So again, if you're the head of marketing, you have to make sure your function works well, but the people who will determine your success are your peers, right? They're the rest of the leaders, again, sales, marketing, engineering, product, whoever they may be, and building those two-way sort of beneficial relationships is going to be the driver, because ultimately to do things at the business scale, it's all about influence, right? None of those people work for you. None of them have to do what you say. You don't have to do what they say. So the only way things happen is by sort of two-way influential relationships where you're both driving towards something positive. And that's why the who is so important after you do the first two pieces.
Let me poke on that a little bit, because I think I know what you're getting at, but I know that if someone might hear it more as, hey, like when you say that your peers are going to be the ones that determine your success, right? My initial thought might be like, no, they're not, right? My success is going to be determined whether or not I can generate the demand that I said that I would generate for the sales team. So I think I know what you're getting at. Help peel that back a little bit more. What do you mean by that your peers are determining your success?
Yeah. And the way to think about it, again, goes back to this executive team, right? Back to the we concept. Who's on your team? Mm-hmm. And your team is now made of people who are not in your discipline. They're made up of non-marketers now, right? And for that team to be successful, so Alec, if you're the head of marketing, the rest of them are going to be talking about you. They're going to say, hey, what do you think of Alec? And you might be the most amazing marketer in the world, but if you've never called me, you've never talked to me, I don't really know what you do. Mm-hmm. It's going to be hard for me to say that guy's amazing. I'm going to be like, I don't know. I've never really talked to him before. So that's kind of the way, compared to previously, why becomes so much more important.
Yep. Yeah. And that's a great answer, I think. And I think the way I would characterize it or say it is like, it's what you were getting at before. Prior to this, right, up to a certain point, your success can be determined on how well you do your job. Mm-hmm. But after a while, your success is going to be dependent on how others view you, part of which is how you do your job. But the other part of it is also how well you relate to them and how well you have fostered that. And that is a huge part of executive presence that maybe sometimes you don't realize how big it is until you get stung by it, right? Until it kind of, zings you in the butt.
Yeah. I think of this as sort of like leadership overall, right? That old adage that you can go fast on your own, you can go farther though within a team, right? And so I know many executives that would say, if I could probably hire one person who's functionally outstanding or another person who's, pretty good at their function and who can gel with the team, maybe that's sometimes the choice they make, right? Because you excel by how well you gel and work as a group. We've all seen companies that in the leadership team, if you're not rowing the same way, it's totally a disaster, right? So this ability to gel and move the business forward as a group really is your career at that point, right?
Exactly. And the reason I always focus on this so much is because we all grow up in a career, right? We do the function we do for a long time. And most people are very comfortable judging themselves as to whether or not they're doing their function well. Are they getting the results? Usually there's some pretty clear metrics. You're either making them or you're not. Mm-hmm. And because it's easier to judge, most people sort of focus there. They're like, but I'm doing so well at the job. This is usually a new muscle for them. It's usually not something that they've thought about, which is why I always kind of try to enforce it, because if you haven't thought about it, it is as important and eventually more important than just the results. And it's just a new muscle, and you have to practice it, and you have to think consciously about who are these people? What is my relationship? And what can I do to improve it? And it's just a new habit that a lot of new executives need to sort of build more as they go through their career.
Drew, talk to this issue of thinking a level above, right? Mm-hmm. Thinking about how you would speak if you were in the next level, because that has something to do with it as well, right?
Yeah, and that's one of those things that most people think about, and it gets shorter the higher up you go. Most people think about their peers, they think about their boss, they might think about their boss's boss if that person still exists. What they often miss is kind of their boss's peers or their boss's boss's peers. Like these people that you don't have to deal with are actually the arbiters of success, right? So even if you report to the CEO, who's the CEO's boss? Typically the board. Do you know the board? Well, if not, there's an opportunity for you, right? So, it's a great way to think about, okay, not just for today, but if you still want to grow in your career, start thinking about sort of, again, one level up, two levels up. If you're early and you just got like 5 levels, it's a little too high, but like 1 or 2 levels up is a perfect place to say, okay, who determines the CEO's success? Okay, if I report to the CEO, well, it'll make me better at helping him or her do their job, but it's also a new set of relationships that you might want to build.
I think it's been a really good conversation because, so we said at the beginning, there something that feels rather intangible and hard to put your finger on. You've done, I think, a nice job of just making it much more tangible. Like, oh, okay, yes, I can do that, or I can start to think that way. I can start to talk that way, and I can start to interact that way. So I think that's what is, to me, was really engaging about kind of this topic and how you present it.
So, Drew, if somebody wanted to utilize your services, and I'm sure this is a great topic for so many who could really benefit from that, where would they find you?
So, I mean, it's drewsaur.com. It's just the name, and on social media and pretty much everywhere. But it's really about, again, how do you make that executive transition? It's always been a passion of mine, and I never liked in my career, I never liked well, just keep at it, just keep going. You're doing well, but just keep going, because, well, which thing am I doing? Which thing is good? Which thing is not good? And so, just as a last thing to everybody is just pick one, right? We talked about a lot of different stuff today. And whenever I coach people, it's always just pick one thing that you can do. It could be about being more concise. It could be about talking about more business. It could be reaching out to some of your partners. Just pick one thing. And as long as you're working on one of these things and you do that regularly, you can absolutely build this as a skill. It is completely attainable by virtually anybody if you do it deliberately and if you sort of target and do some of the stuff we talked about today. So, glad to be here.
Love it. Take the first step. I like that. And for listeners, it's Drew Saur, DrewSaur.com. So that's how to find him. Also, I was remiss in the beginning, so let me just do this right at the very end here. I do want to acknowledge our sponsor for this show, which is Socialize Video. They do all of our post-production video work. And so if you need digital video support for any of your marketing needs, please do go check out socialize.video. Again, that's socialize.video. And if you like our show, please hit subscribe, follow, like, whatever the platform is. That really helps us out. Make sure that more people can tune in the Marketing Share and learn what they need to know in order to run marketing. Thanks for joining us, Drew. And folks, see you next time.